Kia ora koutou. My name is Chris Holmes, and I have the pleasure of heading up the Theology program here at the University of Otago. It's a great honor, and we're delighted to have various friends around Aotearoa, New Zealand, and Chris Clarke is certainly one of them. The Wilberforce Foundation has been a generous supporter of our program and certain faculty members in particular, so we're grateful that Chris is here visiting to give a public lecture and to share some of his wisdom with us. Now, forgive me that I have to read his bio off of a screen. I tried to print it out on the 4th floor of the Burns building, but the blessed photocopier wasn't working properly, so bear with me here. So Chris Clarke, I'm sure, is familiar to most of you. He is the CEO of the Wilberforce Foundation and the executive chair of Aero Leadership New Zealand. He is a chairperson of Te Whakaora Tangata, Canterbury, Oxford Universities, Auckland, New Zealand. So based in Auckland, New Zealand, but does work with other universities around the world, including Canterbury and Oxford. Chris has 25 years of leadership experience, 14 years as a CEO, locally and globally in public policy, healthcare, humanitarian development, and the philanthropic sectors. Currently, he is CEO, as I mentioned, of the Wilberforce Foundation and executive chair of the Aero Leadership Network. Previously, he was the CEO of World Vision New Zealand and the CEO of the Hawke's Bay District Health Board. He has also worked for the World Health Organization in Europe, the National Health Service in Wales, and in a number of health sector roles in New Zealand. Chris holds law and commerce degrees from Canterbury University, and since 2009 has been the inaugural Praxis Visiting Scholar at Green Templeton College at Oxford University in the UK. And Chris is the chairperson of Te Whakaora Tangata, a faith-based trust working with disadvantaged families in South Auckland and Kaitaia. So it's with great pleasure that we welcome Chris to deliver his lecture, Faith Leadership in Extraordinary Times.
Kia ora tātou. It's so lovely to be back and to see some familiar faces, some of whom, of course, I haven't aged, but some of you have aged quite a bit since I last saw you. It's so good to be here. Listening to that biography, perhaps we should have a conversation about the health reforms that were announced yesterday. But it's truly a pleasure to be here. Tonight, what I'm going to do is, over a relatively short period of time, is explore this question of what does it mean to be a faith leader in the extraordinary times in which we live. A faith leader either in terms of a church or maybe in a not-for-profit context. Now, as will come painfully clear, I'm not an academic, I'm a practitioner. So this is really a practitioner perspective on these issues rather than an academic perspective, but naturally they're not a polarity. But that's where we'll be heading tonight in the conversation. So with that thought in mind, let's kind of see what happens next. I want to tell you a remarkable story, and I'm going to use this as a metaphor for this talk, because I remember all the university lectures I've lived through, I can't remember what I was taught, but I do remember some very good metaphors. So if nothing else, I hope you remember this metaphor. And for some of you, you'll remember this day very well. John Bertrand. John Bertrand is an Australian and is regarded as one of the very best America's Cup sailors in the world. And in 1983, Alan Bond gave him this mission, which was to win the America's Cup for Australia. Now, the America's Cup at that stage had been held for 132 years by the Americans. All sorts of people had tried to win it, back from the Americans, but no one had succeeded until John Bertrand. And he came with this exquisite pedigree. For a start, he was an Olympic gold medalist, he was a stunning strategist and technician, and he'd actually participated in a number of campaigns before the 1983 event. He goes on and actually wins the America's Cup off a name you might have heard of if you were a certain vintage, Dennis Conner. And it's won on the very last race with the big keeler boats that we're quite familiar with. And so he ends 132 years of American dominance, and there's a huge celebration extending to New Zealand at finally the America's Cup being won. Well, he retires wisely at that point and goes on and has quite a stellar career as a businessman and all sorts of things like that. But he's lured back. He's lured back to try and win back the America's Cup because the pesky Americans actually just the next time round won it back off the Australians. So they go back to John and say, John, one more time, come and win the America's Cup back off the Americans. And it was too tantalising to say no. Now, some of you will know what's going to happen next. And if I get the technology right, I'll be able to show you what happens next, which is John Bertrand gets himself in a race against Team New Zealand. Let me just play this race without any introduction. It's only 1:20 long. It's delightful.
Now about halfway up, leg number 3, the second beat to windward. It's getting fresher. 18 knots, gusting 20, and the seas are getting bigger. This is becoming quite a tough test now. And Team New Zealand comfortably in front of One Australia. Now there seems a problem on One Australia. See, the backstay's gone loose and the forestay. There is definitely a problem aboard One Australia. Their rigging has gone slack. Why? The boat is turning into a banana. There's real problems here. The crew are summoning the chase boat to come alongside. There are real problems. The boat has snapped in two. The structure has given in. One Australia is taking on a lot of water. This is very serious. Well, now the crew have got to move quickly. They could be in serious trouble, and they're getting off quickly. They could be in danger if they get caught on that rig. They've got to get off the boat fast. The boat is bending. It is going down fast. Look at the 3 on the foredeck. What on earth are they doing? They've got to get off. There's the Team New Zealand chase boat. And they've gone along to pick up the crew. This is incredible. A Formula One racing yacht is breaking up before our eyes and sinking. This is yachting's answer to the Titanic. Look at it go down. They're panicking on getting the crew, making sure they've got the heads, but look how quickly the boat is being sucked into the Pacific. This is incredible. Now you see it, now you don't. In just over a minute from the time the crew started jumping off, the boat has disappeared. In just over 30 seconds from the time the deck was awash, One Australia has been sucked to the bottom of the Pacific.
That was the end of my lecture. Thank you so much. Isn't it terrible how we laugh at misfortune? Why did I play you that video? The reason I played that video is actually what was going on behind the scenes. And it's a metaphor, I think, for leadership in these extraordinary times that we're living in. John Bertrand was the first to win the America's Cup, the best skipper. Alan Bond gave him an unlimited budget to win back the cup. He built with that a $6 million boat, which doesn't sound much these days, but was an eye-watering sum. And he had the very best technology available to him, which was a form of carbon fibre, which was very light but very strong, seemingly, so it could move through the water very quickly. And of course, he also had the ability to get the very best crew. As loyal New Zealanders, we were convinced that Team New Zealand was going to beat him. But actually, if you looked at the fundamentals, this was the better boat and the better team. So what went wrong? And what went wrong in the sense that in a race where Team New Zealand was also competing in exactly the same weather conditions, Team New Zealand didn't sink and actually went on to win the race. And if you know your America's Cup history, actually went on to win the America's Cup. Well, in the review that followed this inquiry, the conclusion was that Australia One, or One Australia, was a fair weather boat. It wasn't designed for the conditions. And as you can see, it was a very lumpy day to be out sailing on that day. In fact, both Australia and New Zealand requested that the race be postponed, but the race committee said, nah, you're racing. And so what we had happening here was a boat designed for 95% of the conditions, which had to then race in above 95% conditions, and actually wasn't built for those conditions. It was a fair weather boat. And so the question I want to explore tonight is, are we just fair weather sailors? And are we sailing beyond the 95%? In other words, are these times as extraordinary as some would suggest? Let's move beyond Peter Montgomery. The challenge for us, I think, here is that for many of us, we have largely survived the COVID-19 pandemic reasonably intact. Some people that we all know have lost jobs, but our mortality rate is remarkably low compared to other parts of the world. And life seemingly is returning to normal. But I do want to challenge that presumption. Recall the United Nations a year ago described this as the worst crisis since World War II. That if we think about the global impact of the pandemic, it is extraordinary. Not just in terms of a mortality rate at around 3 million people, and not just in terms of the fact that global travel has stopped, but particularly in terms of what it has also led to. That in many ways, it's exacerbated pre-existing tensions. So for example, the tribalism that we're seeing in many parts of the world has only been exacerbated through the COVID-19 situation. The inequalities that are there right across the world, we have seen exacerbated. We only need to look at New Zealand to see that actually there's been a vast transference of wealth in the last 12 months since COVID-19. Climate change has continued largely unabated through COVID-19. So COVID-19 has actually, if you like, it's exacerbated tensions that were always there, but haven't tended to get the kind of coverage in the media that they were getting pre-COVID-19. I wonder deeply whether it's also impacting our sense of citizenship. A lot has been written about the miracle of New Zealand in terms of how we responded to COVID. And a lot of the credit for that has been given to the political and health leaders. But also there was, at least at the beginning of the crisis, a quasi-consensus that actually we were doing this for the sake of others. And much of the Prime Minister's languaging was around, we can do this together, we can beat this, that sense of the team of 5 million. Whether that team of 5 million is still intact will be tested as we roll out the vaccine over the coming months. But the sense of citizenship and the sense that I have a responsibility beyond myself to a wider community, I would argue has been threatened rather than enhanced through the COVID-19 pandemic. It is most definitely impacting on the church. For those of you who are church leaders, your services may have resumed. You may even have attracted back many of your previous people who came to church. But a pandemic which impacts not just our theology, but our understanding of mission and our understanding of leadership, I would suggest is actually an extraordinary time. What do I mean by that? Well, first of all, in terms of our understanding of worship, that all of us switched largely from a shared experience of worship where we would collectively come together to sing or worship or whatever, to a situation where actually we could do it electronically. And what was interesting is we could actually start to experiment and experience other leadership styles just simply by going on the internet. Will that stop? Undoubtedly not. Now, is that a bad thing or is that a good thing? Well, that's a conversation to be had. But the idea of a church as a gathering of people who meet together to worship, I'd suggest has been quite seriously challenged by the COVID-19 experience. But it goes beyond that. It goes to our theology of community and our theology of sacraments, and indeed our theology of what it means to be a church. So these are big, significant changes. It goes towards even our understanding of leadership, because one of the things that we've seen happen with COVID-19 is that traditional leadership structures have been flattened out. And then, in fact, what's happening increasingly is that during COVID-19, people were meeting in small groups outside of the assembled church and outside of the established leadership. And I know I go to an Anglican church. Within our own diocese, there was a decision that came out saying that nobody can do communion unless a priest is present. Well, that was challenged by many people saying, well, actually, we don't subscribe to that particular understanding of the priesthood. So whichever way you stand on this, it's sufficient to say that this is a significant change in terms of how we understand church, its theology, its practice, and its leadership. It doesn't end there. If we think about the not-for-profit world, and that's been my experience for much of my recent life, when I worked for World Vision, we had a very simple funding mechanism, which was we got the money to the community as fast as we possibly could. Indeed, I was measured on that. It was one of the performance measures. Why? Because I couldn't write to you, and I've probably written to most of you, with a letter saying there's an urgent need, take your money and put it in my bank account. If there was an urgent need, it needed to be met urgently. The challenge we found, though, when COVID-19 came along, is we didn't have reserves for a rainy day. Now, that wouldn't have mattered because we could have relied on other countries to support us. But when you've got a global pandemic, you can no longer rely on your neighbour. You're completely reliant on yourself. And one of the big challenges for not-for-profits was that actually, quite simply, they ran out of cash. They did not have any reserves for a rainy day. That is but just one of the challenges that are facing not-for-profits, and particularly not-for-profits seeking to work beyond New Zealand, because our understanding of who is my neighbour has been quite challenged by COVID-19, and many are seeing my neighbour as much, much closer to home than it might previously have been. So it's impacting the church, it's impacting the charity, it's impacting our sense of governance. Is this extraordinary? I think it is. The difficulty is, where are we at in these extraordinary times? So Will English spoke at a seminar we organised some time ago, and the comment he made is that at best we're nearing the end of the beginning. So even though we're about to roll out, indeed are rolling out a vaccine, that at best we're near the end of a beginning. That resonated for me for a simple reason that when I worked in the health sector as a DHB CEO, which by now actually by definition are endangered species, but when I worked in the health sector, we were fabulous in a crisis. We'd get a lot of support in a crisis, because what happened in a crisis? In a crisis, you rely on your professionalism. There's a sense in which everyone pulls together. There's a sense in which actually there almost comes a joy, and I use that in inverted commas, because it feels like this is what we were born and designed and so on to do. So the health system is remarkably good in a crisis. Now, a number of you are from the health sector. My experience of the health sector, of the organisation I ran, we were great in a crisis. We weren't necessarily so good when the crisis turned to a chronic condition. In other words, when we had to learn to live with a condition, and it created for us a new normal. Great in a crisis, not so good when it became chronic. In some respects, I think that is the tipping point that we're at, that we've moved beyond the crisis of COVID, but it's not that it's gone away. It's now become a chronic condition, which actually will endure for many times and will actually define a new normal. My experience of leaders in that situation, myself included, is we're not so good. So where does that take us? Where it takes us to is that I don't think anybody truly knows where this is going to take us. Many people are trying to tell us they do, but I think they're being somewhat wishful in their thinking. Suffice it to say that what it does mean is that the conditions in which we sail are going to be beyond the 95% for a long, long, long time to come. So in other words, the John Bertrand boat becomes powerful because have we designed boats just for the 95% or to sail beyond the 95%? So what I want to do is live in that metaphor and talk about my experiences of leading organizations, faith-based organizations in extraordinary times, beyond, if you like, the 95%. A number of points to make. The first observation I'd make is that the critical role of the leader is to define reality. That's not a novel thought. Others have said that many times before me. But what does that mean? What it means is that, particularly for people of faith, it's to put aside our natural optimism and our natural hopefulness and actually define the reality that we're a part of. And that actually this is extraordinary times and that life has changed. That in defining the reality, actually we're doing the kindest things that we can possibly ever do for our teams. Very interestingly, Viktor Frankl, who many of you will be familiar with, writing during the Second World War and writing from the context of refugee camps and imprisonment, was saying that those who survived weren't the optimists. They weren't the optimists who said we'll be home by Easter, we'll be home by Thanksgiving, we'll be home by Christmas. They were the realists because they adopted a posture of realism. I was in a situation with the District Health Board where we'd had fabulous sailing weather, and then suddenly along came a storm. My natural instinct was to be the cheerful optimist. I realised the best thing I could do for my team was to define the reality. And actually, this was a storm that wouldn't blow away in 3 days. It was a storm that would take some casualties, and thus we needed to put on our storm weather gear to actually cope with that storm. But it doesn't end there, just in terms of defining reality. That at the same time, a deep requirement to embody hope. That actually we're not defined by the storm. In a particular storm that I was involved with the District Health Board, very quickly the whole conversation within the organisation became about the storm. But actually that wasn't who we were. The reality was we still had patients coming in every day. We still had babies being born. We still had people buying. We were still caring for people in outpatients and so on. We were still trying to engage with primary care. That was our story, but the danger was that our story would be dominated by the storm. So a very important role for the leader to embody hope. And what is that about? It's not about a cheerful optimism. It doesn't last very long at all. For me, what I realized it looked like was that lovely word constancy. In other words, the way that I'd behaved pre-storm was the way I behaved during the storm. And in organizations, be it a church or not-for-profit, watch incredibly closely their leaders and particularly their behaviors. So prior to the storm, I'd do ward rounds. Prior to the storm, I'd be in the staff cafeteria. Prior to the storm, I was out of my office. In the midst of the storm, I wanted to hunker down and stay in my office. And I had to actually resist that temptation and continue those practices. Now, I didn't realize the significance of that until actually I left the organization some years later, where in the leaving speeches, I suspect people were desperate to try and find something nice to say. But that was the thing that people spoke about. That actually, during the storm, Chris, you just seemed to be the same Chris as pre-storm. Very powerful lesson for us in terms of hopefulness is something which is embodied and shared by actually through the sanctity of the mundane. For any leader, particularly in a storm, and in the kind of storm that we've endured in COVID, is to master our own emotions. I'm sure you've all worked with or alongside colleagues who have an emotional temperature range which swings widely. The trouble with that is, particularly in a storm, you wonder which leader is going to show up on which day. And so being able to manage our own emotions to bring that constancy, I found was critically important. The next point I want to explore with you, and I hope maybe it will come up in questions. Each one of us has a natural leadership style. And in biblical language, there's a number of different metaphors that are used, but metaphors such as the king or the queen, the priest, and the prophet are kind of three metaphors which are often used. Instinctively, in faith-based organizations, I'd observe that most people, their natural suite is probably in the pastoral, priest role, potentially in the prophetic role. No one I've ever met can actually model all three, the king or the queen, the priest, and the prophet. In fact, the only example of that is Jesus himself, who was actually able to master all three forms of leadership. Some people, the very good, can do two. What I found really interesting is a storm is how actually, notwithstanding the fact of being the same yesterday and tomorrow and constancy and so on, was that I had to change my leadership style. So an example of this was, again, at Hawke's Bay. I was appointed the CEO, much to my surprise and probably in hindsight the board's surprise, largely because I was needed to help to bring together the Hastings community and the Napier community. There'd been a new hospital built, Napier had lost out, Hastings got the new hospital. So as a consequence, there were deep rifts between the community, and they needed somebody who didn't have a history, who could come in and help bring that organisation together. That required largely pastoral skills and an element of the prophetic to remind people about what we're about and where we're going. When our storm hit, the organisation didn't need a pastor. What it actually needed was a king. Now, that wasn't my natural suit, but I realised that was actually what was needed. Now, if you watch closely and analyse Jacinda Ardern during the early stages of COVID, I'd suggest to you that you saw a change in leadership style. And what did you see? Much more use of the word of I, much more use of the word we, and much more a sense of we can do this, we can do this. It was a different leadership style than the Prime Minister that we'd seen pre-COVID, and we needed that. It was really interesting when I was watching what was happening in the early days of COVID, I didn't want to see a vulnerable Prime Minister. I didn't want to hear her saying, look, I'm not sure and I'm actually losing a lot of sleep over this. I needed to know at quite a deep level she was in control. Because if she was in control, somehow or other that gave me confidence that things would be all right. And very interestingly, she was asked a question one day about something along the lines of, how are you coping? And I remember thinking, this will be interesting to see how she answered it. She answered it with these words, I have a plan, which I thought was masterful in terms of how she responded. Now, of course, behind the scenes, as a mother, she would have no doubt had all the kind of concerns that the rest of us had. But we needed our leader to be the queen, not the pastor and not the prophet. And what happened there, again, was very carefully moderated, not sympathy, but arguably empathy. So that in a crisis, thinking deeply through essentially what leader shows up and what leader does the organisation need at this time. For most of you who are in any kind of pastoral roles, either as a minister or a vicar or as a senior leader in a not-for-profit, I suggest to you that the role that is probably most needed is the role of the king or the queen. That there are many people who can play the pastoral role, There are some people who can play the prophetic role, but typically only one person can play the role of king or queen in an organisation. So do challenge me on that, but it's certainly something I've been reflecting on quite deeply. It leads to the next point. What I've noticed in organisations in crisis, and I've been guilty of this myself, is the power of groupthink. That what happens is that faced with a common enemy, what we do is we rally around and support each other, and actually supporting each other becomes more important than actually addressing the issue that the enemy, inverted commas, has raised with us. I saw this happen again in one organisation where something that was fairly unjust happened in the organisation, and the team were outraged. But actually behind the injustice were some quite important questions that we needed to address. But our natural instinct was to look after each other and to tribalise and to actually in some ways critique the enemy. That actually the leader in the storm, sailing beyond the 95%, is not to promote groupthink, but actually to ask the challenging, incredibly hard decisions. Which leads to the point about never wasting the crisis. In many ways, we have an extraordinary crisis here in New Zealand to rethink our understanding of citizenship, our understanding of community, how we do church, how the not-for-profit sector engages with the church and with wider society. These are wonderful opportunities. We have wonderful opportunities to engage in questions about how are we going to manage the climate, how are we going to address these issues of inequality. It is most likely we'll miss the opportunity. And our desire to go back to the normal, we will completely miss those opportunities. But Wilberforce did some research during last year looking at how New Zealanders were responding to the COVID crisis. And one of the questions we asked was, what is the New Zealand you want to build back post the crisis? And this was a survey done on 3 different occasions of a representative sample of New Zealanders. What was interestingly was overwhelmingly people said, we want to see the issues of inequality addressed and we want to see the issues around climate addressed. So there is an appetite and a moment for us to actually take the opportunity that the crisis presents to actually address these questions. Whether there's the political will or the moral will to do that, I guess remains to be seen. So don't waste the crisis. In any ship, any boat, until more recent America's Cup's boats, there was a keel. That's the thing which sits below the waterline, which we don't normally see. The keel does a number of things. It provides stability, it provides direction, but one of the other things that a keel does, if you've ever been in a keeler, and particularly when the wind's really coming across it, is it actually stops the boat being shifted off course. It actually provides some strength to stop being naturally blown away. Many of the challenges facing churches and not-for-profit organisations is what we talk about as mission drift, is that we actually lose sight of what is our key focus and our key purpose, overwhelmed as we are by the scale of the storm or the situation that's around us. Key role for the critical leader is to remind people of the story of the organisation. Remember when, remember when, remember when. And for those of you familiar with your Bibles, you'll know that actually you don't need to go very far into the Old Testament to see how so often Moses and Joshua and so many of the great leaders remember when, remember when, remember when. 2 final thoughts in terms of some thinking around being a skipper in a storm. And the first is this, that as a leader of a faith-based organisation is not to neglect the spiritual needs of your team. You know, we can be so focused on looking after church membership or our not-for-profit staff or our supporters or whatever, that we neglect the fact that actually our own staff are experiencing exactly the same kind of storm conditions that we're experiencing. And they'll be manifesting that in all sorts of ways, some of it not necessarily helpful. It might be manifest in terms of bad behaviour, it might be manifest in terms of just grumpiness, it may be manifest in terms of just people just not turning up. And that we have a critical role to actually name and address the spiritual needs of the team. This comes particularly important in a crisis. Because I remember again with World Vision, we spent some time with my board talking through what's the number one risk that we face as an organisation. And the predictable culprits came up. A financial shortfall, a reputational issue, all these types of things. But actually our number one risk wasn't that at all. Our number one risk was failing to discern the heart and mind of God for our organisation. Because actually that's what defines and distinguishes a faith-based organisation from another type of organisation. But to have that capacity to be able to discern what the Lord is saying through the Holy Spirit to an organisation requires a spiritual dexterity and an openness and a closeness in a leadership team. And that for us was a real challenge. I remember saying to the team that, for us to do this well, actually my spiritual walk is no longer a private affair. Collectively, we need to be spiritually healthy. So actually, collectively, we need to be asking questions of each other. And one of the newest in the team said to me, but I didn't sign up for that. And I was expecting some resistance from him. But he said, I would absolutely love that. And so the sense in which we become acutely aware of the spiritual needs of our team, because if we're not doing that, how can we lead our faith-based organisations? The last point to make, and it's such a pragmatic one, but it's derailed me on a couple of occasions in the midst of a crisis, is paying attention to the diary. I almost didn't put this in, it seems so practical. But what I've found happening in a storm or in a crisis is everybody wants your attention and everybody wants access to your diary. And unless you're incredibly careful, you can be distracted off what actually your main purpose is. So keeping control of your diary in a crisis is so simple and so fundamental, but failure to do that, I would argue, will mean that you end up being just a fair weather sailor. How are we doing? A few more minutes? Excellent. Let me just go for make 2 or 3 more points. Just briefly to talk about the crew. So using the metaphor of the boat and sailing in the 95% of the conditions, we talked about the skipper. To briefly touch on the crew. We've been testing, as I say, over the last year, New Zealanders' attitudes to COVID-19. What's come through is that most New Zealanders have maintained a sense of hopefulness, significantly above other countries in the world. That most of them are prioritising family and healthcare. This will come as no surprise, but like lots of research, and this is social research, it's quite useful to know that it's verified, and have expressed confidence in the leadership of the COVID response in New Zealand. But, and it's a huge but, is that actually we're seeing simultaneously a second pandemic. And it's this pandemic of mental unwellness, particularly among our younger people. And that came through very strongly in our COVID research and has come through very strongly in other situations. And any of you in pastoral roles will be seeing that. And it's expressed in lower resiliency and in serious mental unwellness. And the challenge for us is to look to Christchurch, where, in fact, the impact of the Christchurch earthquakes ended up often being expressed 3, 4, 5 years after the initial quakes. And the impact on mental health services actually had about a 5 to 6 year tail. So we need to be very alert to the fact that we are dealing with a second and far more pernicious epidemic or pandemic in our community, which is much harder to challenge than the one that we think we're addressing. The wind. A boat needs wind. Just to remind you, it was just about a month ago that we won the America's Cup. A lovely quote from T.S. Eliot. We all had the experience, but few the meaning. There's a deep opportunity, I think, in this extraordinary time to reflect deeply on the meaning of the experience that we've been through. I've touched on the issue of discernment and this critical role that leadership teams play in terms of discerning the heart and mind of God. Failure to do that, I would argue, will lead us to enormous, enormous challenges. Failure to address the issues of groupthink will mean that it's almost inevitable that we'll fail actually to discern the heart and mind of God. As part of that, the power of the pause. In the midst of a crisis, the instinct is just to do something, if only to reassure yourself. Very interestingly, the research that's been done into the 1918-19 pandemic in New Zealand and the response to that talks about how the leaders actually literally paused and reflected before they acted. Critical as leaders of our organisations that we similarly take the power of the pause before we act. That's where the deep wisdom and that's where the deep discernment comes from. That, as we touched on earlier, that the crisis has created, I think, a whole series of quite significant theological and missiological questions. We don't want to squander the opportunity to be thinking about what that means. So don't waste the crisis. As part of that, thinking through our whole ecclesiology in terms of our understanding of the church, both the church scattered and the church gathered. And a massive shout out here to the School of Theology, in the sense that the investment that you've made in terms of chaplaincy is hugely exciting. In terms of recognising that the church of the future may be out there, in the schools, in the hospitals, in the prisons, among the media, and so on, more so than it is actually in here. It's something that, from a Wilberforce point of view, we're hugely excited about. But lastly, the Holy Spirit, when he breathes and blows, blows in powerful and most unexpected ways. For me, one of the great joys, if there's ever a joy in a crisis, was realising that new leaders emerge. One of the tragedies is that not all your leaders can cope with the crisis. In fact, that's really where truly the loneliness of the leader comes through, where good, faithful people actually struggle in the crisis. And you realise they actually can't be a part of your future as an organisation. And that's been some of the most painful conversations I've ever had with leaders, which is trying to acknowledge the contribution, but not for the season to come. But the joy is that how in a crisis, oftentimes new leaders emerge. And to my surprise and delight, they've often been there all along, sitting at the margins of my organisation, not feeling heard, not feeling recognised, whatever. But in a crisis, suddenly come to the fore. So again, one of the absolute joys of leadership in a crisis. I want to finish with a quote. Again, keeping somewhat the nautical metaphor. Charles Raven, known to all of you, Professor of Divinity at Cambridge University back in the 1930s, with a quote which I think describes something of the journey of the leader through extraordinary times, that most people have, at some time or other, to stand alone and to suffer. And their final shape is determined by their response to their probation. There's actually a lot in that sentence. And they emerge either as slaves of circumstance, in other words, as those people who can only sail the 95%, or, in some senses, as captains of their soul. Now, forgive the slightly archaic language, but you get the sense of this. That actually what is needed in these extraordinary times is leaders who are, in some senses, captains of their soul. Which is a prompt to put up this slide, which is that coterminous with COVID-19 has been the extraordinary story of Ravi Zacharias. And without exploring that story in any detail tonight, well-recognised evangelist and apologist who dies, and then it's discovered that he has an extraordinary and incredibly unhealthy life, which has done huge damage to lots of people post his death. But I think what it leads to is the responsibility of all of us who are leaders in these extraordinary times to nurture our backstage and not just our front stage. And what is that? If we use the nautical metaphor, it's our keel. It's that thing that is below the waterline. If we use the metaphor of the stage, all of us are actors on the stage, if you're a leader, by definition. How do we support our backstage? In other words, those things that give meaning to our performance. I would surmise that in the case of Ravi Zacharias, Bill Hybels and others, that as the front stage got bigger and the audience got bigger and as the demands of leadership got bigger, the backstage shrunk proportionately. And ultimately wasn't actually able to support the front stage performance. So what we've done is covered a whole lot of impressions, I say principally as a practitioner rather than as an academic, in terms of the leader in the storm. What are the lumpy seas that we're sailing in? And I think they are extraordinary times, though what they mean, I suggest we don't yet know, nor will we know, but at best we're near the end of the beginning. We've looked at the role of the skipper, in particular. We've looked a little bit at the crew. We've spoken about the wind and the Holy Spirit, and just what the Holy Spirit might be seeking to do here. But I want to finish with the challenge to all of us as leaders, is that if we are sailing in extraordinary times, and if we've moved beyond the immediate crisis and are now grappling with a new normal, but the chronic stage, which could last for many, 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 many years, then actually we owe it to ourselves, we owe it to our Lord, and we certainly owe it to the communities that we serve to nurture a strong and vibrant backstage. The authentic leader. A quote that I dearly love. It's not the critic who counts, not those who point out where our strong people stumbled, or where the doer of the deed could have done better. Well, that deals with most political discourse in New Zealand and elsewhere. The credit belongs to those who are actually in the arena, whose faces are marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strive valiantly, who err and come short again and again, who know great enthusiasms, who at best know the triumph of high achievement, and who at worst, if they fall, at least fall while daring greatly, so that their place will never be with those cold and timid souls who know neither victory nor defeat. I think that's a good place to end, that all of us as leaders, perhaps the message is simply this: do not be too hard on yourselves, because you're in the arena and you're marred by dust and dirt. But unlike your critics, you're actually in the arena. Let's pause there, and I think we've got a little bit of time for questions or comments.
It's really been a privilege to listen to you, Chris, as you have opened up this 2020 onwards and as an extraordinary time for us, and ways that we might think about how the extraordinary will become ordinary, how we will need to respond to that which is both extraordinary and ordinary at the same time. And you've given us so much to think about in such a positive way. I think we're all extremely grateful to you for your time and energy, insight and wisdom. Thank you very much. Please join me in thanking Chris.